If I told you that everything inside Buckingham Palace just changed in the last 5 minutes, would you believe it? Because according to multiple insiders, King Charles has quietly set into motion a decision that will transform the future of the monarchy. And the person at the center of this political earthquake is none other than Prince William. While the palace is scrambling to maintain silence, sources confirm that the king has begun the formal process of passing the crown to his eldest son, a move so sudden and so disruptive that Queen Camilla is reportedly furious beyond words. The tension has been building for months, behind the polished balcony appearances and carefully arranged public smiles. The royal household has been fighting a silent war. Charles's declining health, William's rising authority, and Camilla's increasing attempts to consolidate power have collided into a breaking point. But no one expected the king to move this quickly. No one expected William to be summoned to a private meeting just hours before the decision leaked. And certainly no one expected Camilla to be completely excluded from the discussion. Insiders claim that Camilla confronted the king immediately after discovering the truth, accusing senior courtiers of orchestrating a palace coup to sideline her permanently. But the reality may be far more complicated. Some say Charles wants stability, others say William demanded clarity, and a few believe that damaging information about Camilla's political influence pushed the king to act before it was too late. What we know for sure is this: a transition of power is unfolding. A queen is enraged. A future king is stepping forward. And the entire monarchy is bracing for impact. Because tonight, the crown has shifted, and nothing inside Buckingham Palace will ever be the same again. The fog hung heavy over Balmoral Castle on the morning of November 18th, 2025, wrapping the Scottish estate in a shroud of grey that seemed to mirror the somber mood within its ancient walls. King Charles sat alone in his private study, the room where Queen Victoria had once conducted affairs of state, where generations of monarchs had wrestled with decisions that shaped nations. Before him lay a single sheet of paper, the words typed in formal legal language that belied the revolutionary nature of its content. It was an instrument of abdication prepared in absolute secrecy by constitutional lawyers sworn to confidentiality, a document that would end his reign barely 3 years after it had begun. The decision had not come suddenly, though its formalization had accelerated in recent weeks. Charles had ascended to the throne in September 2022 at the age of 73. Already the oldest person ever to assume the British crown, he had waited longer than any heir in the nation's history, spending decades preparing for a role that seemed perpetually just beyond reach. When it finally came, following his mother's death at Balmoral, he had embraced it with determination and energy that surprised those who had questioned whether he possessed the stamina for the demands of modern monarchy. But 3 years of relentless duty had taken a toll that could no longer be ignored or minimized. The health issues had begun subtly, fatigue that lingered despite adequate rest, a persistent cough that antibiotics could not fully resolve, joint pain that made standing through lengthy ceremonies increasingly difficult. His medical team had initially attributed these symptoms to age and stress, prescribing rest and adjusted schedules. But when routine scans in September revealed abnormalities requiring further investigation, the situation became far more serious. The diagnosis, delivered privately in early October, was not immediately life-threatening but was progressive and would require treatment incompatible with the demands of his constitutional role. Charles faced the prognosis with the stoicism bred through decades of public service and personal crisis. He had survived the dissolution of his first marriage under brutal media scrutiny, weathered the death of Diana and the public grief that followed, endured years of being portrayed as an eccentric waiting impatiently for power he did not deserve. He had rebuilt his reputation painstakingly, married the woman he loved despite fierce opposition, and finally assumed the throne with genuine public support. The idea of surrendering the crown after such a brief reign felt like cosmic cruelty, a final joke at the expense of someone who had already endured more than his share of humiliation and disappointment. But Charles was nothing if not dutiful. He understood constitutional monarchy in ways few others could. having studied its requirements and limitations for 7 decades. He knew the crown required not just symbolic presence but active engagement, mental acuity, and physical stamina to maintain the relentless schedule of duties that sustained the institution's relevance. He had watched his mother serve with dedication until her final days. While he admired her commitment, he had also seen how her determination never to abdicate had created awkward situations in her final years when age diminished her capacity. Yet duty demanded continuation. The constitutional lawyers had explained the precedent carefully. Britain had not seen a voluntary abdication since Edward VIII in 1936, an event so traumatic it had reshaped the monarchy and was still referenced as a cautionary tale nearly 90 years later. Edward's abdication had been driven by desire to marry a divorced woman, a personal choice that put individual happiness above duty. What Charles contemplated was fundamentally different, stepping aside not for personal gratification, but because medical reality made continuing irresponsible. The distinction mattered enormously in how such an action would be perceived and whether the institution could survive it intact. He had confided in only a handful of people, his private secretary, who had served him for 22 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury, 2 senior constitutional experts whose discretion was absolute, and eventually William, whose reaction would determine whether this path was even possible. The conversation with his eldest son had occurred 3 weeks earlier in this same study, during what was publicly described as a routine private visit to Balmoral. Charles had presented the medical realities without embellishment, shown William the documentation, and explained the prognosis and treatment requirements. He watched his son's face cycle through shock, denial, grief, and finally reluctant acceptance as the implications became clear. William had begged him to seek additional opinions, to explore every possible treatment option that might allow him to continue. But when those alternatives had been exhausted and the medical consensus remained unchanged, William had reached the same conclusion. Continuation was not sustainable. What followed had been the most difficult negotiation of both their lives. William, at 43, had expected to have at least another decade, perhaps 2, before assuming the throne. He had 3 young children, the youngest barely 7 years old. Catherine was still recovering from her own health challenges, regaining strength, but not yet fully restored. The idea of becoming king while his children were still in primary and secondary school, while his wife remained fragile, felt overwhelming. But duty, that inexorable force that had shaped both their lives since birth, left no room for personal preference or convenient timing. Camilla's discovery. Queen Camilla had discovered her husband's intention in the worst possible way, by accident, through overhearing a conversation she was never meant to witness. She had returned to Balmoral unexpectedly early from a visit to a local hospital, cutting the engagement short because of a migraine, entering through a side entrance to avoid staff fuss. She had been walking toward the private apartments when she heard voices from Charles's study. The door was slightly ajar and her husband's voice, heavy with emotion, carried into the corridor. "I have no choice," she heard him say. "The treatment protocol is incompatible with the demands of the role. I must step aside while I can do so with dignity rather than wait until circumstances force the issue." Camilla froze in the hallway, her blood turning cold as the implications crashed over her. She heard William's voice responding, discussing timelines and announcements, talking about transition planning and constitutional requirements. They were planning an abdication. Her husband, who had waited his entire life to be king, who had endured decades of preparation and criticism, who had been on the throne less than 3 years, was planning to surrender the crown, and he had not told her. She stood paralyzed, listening to them discuss how to inform her when the appropriate moment might be, how she might react. They were talking about her as though she were a problem to be managed rather than a partner who deserved to be consulted. When she finally pushed open the door, both men fell silent, their expressions confirming that what she had overheard was exactly what it seemed. The confrontation that followed was described by those who heard raised voices through heavy doors as volcanic. Camilla's fury was comprehensive and devastating. She raged at Charles for excluding her from a decision that would fundamentally alter her life and identity. She demanded to know how long he had been planning this, how many people he had consulted while keeping her deliberately ignorant. She accused him of cowardice, of abandoning the responsibility they were meant to share, of caring more about his legacy than about their partnership. Charles attempted to explain, to outline the medical realities, to help her understand that this was not choice but necessity. But Camilla was beyond reason, beyond comfort. She had spent 20 years fighting for acceptance, enduring comparison to Diana, weathering public opinion that ranged from grudging tolerance to active hostility. She had finally achieved the position of queen consort, had begun to make the role her own, had started to feel that perhaps she had earned her place, and now, after barely 3 years, it was being ripped away. She would go from queen to queen dowager, from consort to the current king to widow equivalent of a former king, a demotion in everything but technical title. What enraged her most was the timing. Had Charles's reign lasted a decade or more, she could have accepted abdication as a reasonable response to declining health and old age. But 3 years felt like a cruel joke. Barely enough time to warm the throne before surrendering it. She felt cheated of the role she had sacrificed so much to obtain, robbed of the opportunity to truly make her mark as queen. The charities she had championed, the causes she had promoted, the carefully constructed public image she had built, all of it would be diminished by the brevity of her tenure and the manner of its ending. Her anger toward William was even more intense. She accused him of pushing his father toward abdication, of being impatient to assume power, of prioritizing his own timeline over his father's well-being. The accusation was unfair, and she likely knew it even as she made it. But rage seeks targets, and William was conveniently present. He attempted to defend himself, to explain that he had argued against abdication, that he had begged his father to explore every alternative. But Camilla was not interested in his explanations. She saw in him the person who would benefit from her loss, who would ascend while she descended, whose wife would become queen while she became a footnote. The confrontation ended with Camilla storming from the study, retreating to her private rooms and refusing to see or speak to Charles for 3 days. The household staff moved carefully through the castle, aware that something catastrophic had occurred, but uncertain of details. Meals were sent to separate rooms. Schedules were adjusted to prevent accidental encounters. The king and queen of the United Kingdom were not speaking. And the tension radiated through every corridor and chamber of the estate. Charles, miserable and guilt-ridden, threw himself into finalizing the abdication plans, perhaps finding in bureaucratic details a distraction from emotional devastation. When Camilla finally emerged from her self-imposed isolation, it was not with acceptance but with strategy. She began making calls to her own advisors, to friends with legal expertise, to people who might help her understand her options and rights. She discovered that as queen consort, her position was entirely derivative of her husband's. If he abdicated, she had no independent constitutional role. She would retain the title Queen Camilla for life as the widow equivalent of a former king. But she would have no official duties, no platform, no purpose beyond that which she could construct independently. Everything she had built was tied to Charles's position, and when he stepped down, her relevance stepped down with him. The institutional machinery engages. While the personal drama unfolded at Balmoral, the machinery of constitutional transition began grinding into motion. The Prime Minister was briefed in a private meeting at Downing Street, the conversation protected by protocols that ensured no record would be kept and no staff would be present. The governmental response was carefully neutral. Ministers understood that the crown's continuity mattered more than any individual monarch, and a smooth transition from father to son posed far fewer constitutional complications than a prolonged decline in a king unable to fully execute his duties. Political calculation favored support for abdication, though no politician would say so publicly. The Archbishop of Canterbury convened a small group of senior clergy to discuss the theological and ceremonial implications. The coronation of Charles had occurred barely 2 years prior, an elaborate ceremony costing millions and watched by billions globally. The idea of conducting another coronation so soon felt excessive, yet William's accession would require formal recognition and blessing. Discussions began about creating a modified ceremony, something that acknowledged the solemnity of the moment without the full pageantry of a traditional coronation. The balance between maintaining appropriate dignity and avoiding the appearance of wasteful repetition required careful consideration. Constitutional experts grappled with questions that had no modern precedent. What would be Charles's title after abdication? Would he remain a counselor of state, or would that role pass exclusively to working royals in the new reign? Where would he live? Given that sovereign residences would transfer to William, what financial arrangements would apply and how would they be funded? The sovereign grant was designed for the reigning monarch, not for a living former king. Every question spawned additional complications, each requiring resolution before any public announcement could be made. The palace communications team, brought into the planning at this stage, began crafting the narrative that would accompany the announcement. The messaging needed to emphasize duty and continuity, to present the abdication as responsible stewardship rather than abandonment. They drafted statements highlighting Charles's dedication to the crown, his determination to ensure the monarchy's strength by facilitating transition while he could still guide it, his confidence in William's readiness to assume the throne. Every word was tested against potential public reaction, adjusted to minimize shock while maintaining honesty about the medical realities driving the decision. Security services conducted their own assessments. An abdication would create a period of vulnerability, a moment when the established order was in flux and various groups might seek to exploit uncertainty. Threats were evaluated, protection details adjusted, contingencies planned for scenarios ranging from political protest to potential violence from extremist groups. The transition itself would be a massive security operation requiring coordination across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Plans were developed in secret, ready to be activated the moment the decision became public. Behind all the institutional preparation lay a fundamental question nobody wanted to articulate directly. Would the public accept this? Edward VIII's abdication had traumatized the nation, created a constitutional crisis, and permanently stained the monarchy's reputation. That abdication had been driven by selfish desire, but even a medically necessary abdication carried risks. Would the public understand Charles's reasoning, or would they view it as weakness? Would they accept William and Catherine as king and queen despite their relative youth? Or would resentment at losing Charles so soon poison the transition? Public opinion research conducted carefully to avoid revealing the true purpose provided mixed signals that reassured no one. The decision was made to inform certain key family members before any public announcement. Princess Anne was told first, her practical nature and institutional knowledge making her feedback valuable. Her reaction was supportive of Charles but concerned about Camilla, whom she had come to genuinely respect despite their complicated history. She volunteered to speak with the Queen to help her understand that this was not betrayal but medical necessity. Prince Edward was informed next. His response was characterized by sadness for his brother but acceptance of the logic. Sophie immediately began thinking about how to support Catherine through the transition, knowing the younger woman would need guidance from someone who had navigated royal life successfully. Prince Harry presented a unique challenge. Relations remained strained despite occasional reconciliation attempts. But his position as son of the former king and brother of the incoming king meant he could not be left uninformed until the public announcement. The notification was handled delicately, with assurances that his security concerns would be considered in transition planning and that he would be welcomed at any ceremonial events he chose to attend. His response, conveyed through intermediaries, was supportive of his father's decision while maintaining distance from institutional matters. He would not oppose the abdication, but neither would he involve himself in planning or public advocacy for it. Camilla's campaign. As the abdication planning progressed toward an announcement date tentatively set for mid-December, Camilla launched her own campaign to prevent or at least delay the transition. She began with appeals to Charles's sense of duty, reminding him of the sacred vows made at his coronation, the promises to serve until death. She argued that medical treatment had advanced remarkably, that his condition might be manageable with proper care, that abandoning the throne after such brief tenure would damage the institution he claimed to be protecting. Her arguments were passionate and grounded in genuine belief that abdication was wrong. When appeals to duty failed, Camilla shifted to personal arguments. She spoke about their relationship, the decades they had waited to be together openly, the short time they had served as king and queen. She reminded him how hard she had worked to earn public acceptance, of the causes she had championed, of the difference she was beginning to make. The abdication would truncate all of that, reduce her tenure to a historical footnote, waste the goodwill she had painstakingly accumulated. Did he not owe her the chance to complete what she had started? Charles, torn between love for his wife and conviction that abdication was necessary, tried to show her alternative paths forward. She could continue charitable work independently, maintain patronages and public engagements as Queen Dowager, have resources and platform, perhaps even more freedom without constitutional constraints. But Camilla rejected these reassurances as hollow comfort. Queen Dowager was a title for widows. She argued, a designation that emphasized what had been lost rather than what remained. She had not fought for decades to be queen, only to have the role stolen after 3 years. Her most potent weapon was emotional manipulation. Deployed with the skill of someone who understood Charles's vulnerabilities intimately. She wept about feeling abandoned, about being excluded from a decision that affected her profoundly, about watching her husband surrender the position he had been born to occupy. She questioned whether his medical team was being overly cautious, whether he was using health as an excuse to escape responsibilities he found burdensome, whether he was sacrificing their partnership to smooth William's path to power. The accusations hurt precisely because they contained slivers of uncomfortable truth Charles could not entirely dismiss. She also began lobbying others who might influence the king's decision. She appealed to Princess Anne, arguing Charles deserved support from his siblings in resisting pressure to abdicate. Anne, characteristically blunt, told Camilla that while she sympathized, Charles's health had to take precedence over anyone's desires, including Camilla's own. She reached out to longtime friends of Charles, hoping they would counsel him against abdication. Most responded with sympathy but refused to interfere. Most controversially, Camilla attempted to appeal directly to William, requesting a private meeting without Charles present. The meeting at Clarence House, with only the two of them present, was later described as intensely uncomfortable. Camilla asked William to refuse the crown, to insist his father continue ruling, to prioritize Charles's emotional well-being over institutional convenience. William, maintaining respectful composure despite the awkwardness, explained that he could no more refuse his constitutional duty than she could demand his father continue in a role his health made unsustainable. Camilla left convinced William was eager to become king regardless of the cost to his father or stepmother. The campaign created an impossible situation for Charles. He loved his wife deeply, understood her anger and disappointment, wanted desperately to give her what she sought, but he could not ignore medical reality or subordinate constitutional responsibility to personal desire. The tension between these competing demands left him exhausted and miserable, caught between the woman he loved and the duty he could not escape. Friends who saw him during this period described a man aging visibly, the stress compounding the health issues that had prompted the abdication in the first place. The announcement and its aftermath. The announcement came on 10 December in a televised address from Windsor Castle that interrupted regular programming across the nation. Charles sat alone at a desk, the setting deliberately intimate rather than grand and ceremonial. His appearance shocked those who had not seen him recently. He looked older than his 77 years, tired and drawn. The the toll of recent months evident in his face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of emotions barely held in check. He began by expressing love for his country and gratitude for the privilege of serving as king, even briefly. He acknowledged that his reign had been shorter than anyone anticipated, shorter than he had wished. Then he detailed the medical realities that necessitated his decision, speaking with candor unusual for royal communications. He explained that his condition required treatment incompatible with the demanding schedule and responsibilities of monarchy, that continuing would be irresponsible to the nation and unfair to the institution. He had consulted widely and assured viewers the decision, while painful, was correct. Charles spoke with evident pride about William, describing his son's preparation, dedication to duty, and deep love for the nation. He expressed confidence that William and Catherine would serve with distinction and honor, that the monarchy would be strengthened by the transition despite its unexpected timing. He asked the British people to support the new king and queen with the same loyalty and affection they had shown him and his mother before him. His voice broke as he thanked Camilla for her partnership and patience in supporting him even through this difficult decision that affected her so profoundly. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms crashed under the volume of traffic. News organizations scrambled to provide context and analysis. Constitutional experts were dragged from dinner parties to television studios to explain what would happen next. The public reaction was complex and divided. Many expressed sympathy for Charles's health situation and admiration for his willingness to prioritize the monarchy's strength over personal desire to continue ruling. Others felt cheated, having waited so long for his reign only to see it end almost before it began. Some questioned whether abdication was truly necessary or whether he was being pushed out by younger royals eager for power. Camilla was conspicuously absent from the announcement, her absence noted by every commentator and observer. Official statements said she was supporting her husband privately, but those close knew she had refused to appear alongside Charles, had insisted she could not pretend to support a decision she believed fundamentally wrong. Her absence spoke volumes about the state of their relationship and the depth of the rift the abdication had created. In the days following, she maintained her scheduled engagements but appeared diminished, going through the motions with none of her usual energy or warmth. The transition period was set at 6 weeks, allowing time for necessary constitutional procedures and ceremonial preparations without drawing out the process unnecessarily. William and Catherine moved into intensive briefings, absorbing information about constitutional responsibilities, security protocols, international relationships, and the thousands of details that comprised modern monarchy. Both appeared overwhelmed but determined, understanding that circumstances had forced upon them a role they had expected to assume decades in the future. Catherine, still not fully recovered from her own health challenges, visibly struggled with the demands while maintaining a composed public presence. The ceremony of transition, held on 25 January 2026, was deliberately understated. Not a full coronation, but a solemn service of recognition at Westminster Abbey, attended by dignitaries and family without the elaborate pageantry that had marked Charles's coronation. Charles himself participated, formally transferring authority to William in a moment fraught with symbolism and emotion. When father placed the crown on son's head, both men had tears streaming down their faces. The personal pain of the moment overwhelmed protocol and dignity. Camilla watched from the congregation, her expression a mask that revealed nothing of her internal turmoil. In the immediate aftermath, Charles and Camilla retreated to a private estate in Scotland, away from public view and media speculation. The plan was for rest and adjustment, allowing them both to process the magnitude of what had occurred and to find new equilibrium in their changed circumstances. But those close to the couple reported that the relationship remained strained, that Camilla's anger had not dissipated, that she struggled to accept her diminished role and continued to blame both Charles and William for what she viewed as an unnecessary surrender. Charles, meanwhile, faced his own adjustment challenges, having spent his entire life preparing to be king, having finally achieved the role. Stepping away created an identity crisis no amount of planning could fully prepare him for. He was no longer the sovereign, no longer the final constitutional authority, no longer the person everyone turned to for decision and direction. He was a former king, a living reminder of abdication, a figure without clear purpose or defined role. The loss of identity was profound and disorienting, compounded by guilt over how his decision had hurt Camilla and disrupted William's family life. The new reign and old wounds King William V's reign began under circumstances no one had anticipated. At 43, he was young by monarchical standards, yet burdened by responsibilities that would challenge someone decades older. Catherine, now queen consort, faced even steeper challenges. She had expected years to prepare, time to fully recover her health and strength, a gradual transition into increased duties. Instead, she was thrust immediately into the most visible position in the nation while still fragile from illness and treatment. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. Their children faced the most dramatic adjustment. Prince George at 12 suddenly became heir to the throne. Princess Charlotte, 10, and Prince Louis, 8, found their lives transformed overnight. Security increased dramatically. Media attention intensified. The family struggled to maintain normality while adapting to a new reality that intruded on every aspect of their lives. William's first months as king were characterized by careful continuity mixed with subtle changes. He maintained most of his father's appointments and policies while quietly beginning to implement his own vision for a streamlined, more focused monarchy. The number of working royals was reduced. Public spending on royal activities was scrutinized more carefully. The emphasis shifted toward younger generations and future sustainability rather than honoring traditions that no longer served clear purpose. These changes were presented as natural evolution, but everyone understood they represented William's distinct vision, different from what Charles had pursued during his brief reign. The relationship between William and his father remained cordial but complicated. They spoke regularly, with William seeking Charles's advice and Charles offering guidance when asked. But an underlying tension persisted, unspoken but palpable. Charles struggled with watching someone else occupy the role he had prepared for all his life and occupied so briefly. William felt perpetual guilt about benefiting from circumstances he had not created or desired. Both tried to maintain an appropriate relationship while navigating emotions that protocol and family loyalty required them to suppress rather than fully express or resolve. Camilla's situation became increasingly difficult as months passed and the reality of her changed circumstances settled in. As Queen Dowager, she maintained certain patronages and continued some public work, but the platform and resources available to her were dramatically reduced. She was no longer a central figure in national life, but rather a historical footnote, the woman who had been queen consort for 3 years before her husband's unprecedented abdication. The brevity of her tenure and the manner of its ending defined her legacy in ways she found unbearable. Her relationship with Charles deteriorated further during the first year after abdication. Living together in reduced circumstances, no longer united by shared public role, they discovered that the partnership that had endured scandal and opposition struggled when stripped of the purpose that had sustained it. Camilla could not forgive Charles for the abdication, for ending her time as queen before she felt she had truly begun. Charles, dealing with his own grief and identity crisis, had little emotional reserve to support his wife through her parallel struggles. They grew distant, maintaining appearances when necessary, but living increasingly separate lives within their shared household. The most painful aspect for both was watching William and Catherine succeed in roles that had been theirs so briefly. Every successful engagement, every positive media coverage, every public triumph for the new king and queen felt like an implicit criticism of what Charles and Camilla had surrendered or lost. Rationally, they understood institutional success was positive regardless of who occupied the throne. Emotionally, it was agonizing to watch others flourish in positions they had barely begun to make their own before circumstances forced them aside. Public perception of the abdication evolved over time. Initial shock gave way to acceptance, then to something approaching appreciation for Charles's willingness to prioritize institutional health over personal pride. His decision was increasingly viewed as selfless rather than weak, as evidence of devotion to crown over ego. But this positive reframing offered little comfort to Camilla, who remained convinced the abdication had been unnecessary and premature. The divergence between public narrative and her private conviction deepened her sense of isolation and bitterness. The health issues that had prompted the abdication proved more manageable than the initial prognosis suggested, a development that both validated Charles's caution and made Camilla's anger more acute. If treatment was working and his condition stabilizing, she argued, then the abdication had indeed been unnecessary. Charles could have continued ruling while managing his health, could have given them both more time to serve and solidify their legacy. That the abdication could not be undone, that William was now king and would remain so regardless of Charles's health improvements, made the situation even more frustrating and irreversible. 2 years after the abdication, Charles and Camilla separated quietly. The arrangement was announced through a brief palace statement that emphasized it was an amicable decision to pursue different paths while maintaining respect and affection. The truth known to those close to them was that Camilla could not forgive or move past her anger, and Charles could not bear the constant reminder of how his decision had destroyed his wife's dreams and damaged their relationship beyond repair. The separation was sad but inevitable. The final casualty of an abdication that had been medically necessary but personally devastating. Charles lived out his remaining years in increasing isolation, maintained contact with his sons, but never fully recovered his sense of purpose or identity. He pursued scholarly interests, wrote extensively about environmental causes he had championed for decades, and occasionally appeared at ceremonial events when protocol required. But he remained a figure out of time, a king who had ruled too briefly to be remembered for accomplishment and who had abdicated under circumstances that, however justified, marked him permanently as the monarch who had given up the crown. When he died at 84, the public mourning was genuine but muted. Recognition of a complicated figure who had served dutifully, but whose reign would always be overshadowed by its unprecedented end. Camilla outlived him by several years, maintaining her separate existence, continuing charitable work, and cultivating relationships with her children and grandchildren, who remained her primary source of joy and purpose. She never reconciled herself to what had been taken from her, never fully accepted that the abdication had been necessary, never stopped believing that she had been cheated of the role she had fought so hard to obtain and had barely begun to truly occupy. In her final years, when asked about her time as queen consort, she would simply say it had been too brief. The words heavy with all the bitterness and regret that 3 years on the throne in a lifetime of longing could not resolve or redeem.